In the last video, we talked about how the Bible is a library of different documents written over 1,500 years by 30 different authors. And so the question is, how did it all come together? How did it come together to make this? How do we get the Bible? I'm going to try and simplify a complex, messy history into 5 simple steps. Step 1, writing. The Bible was written under lots of different circumstances. Sometimes God told someone to write something down. Sometimes there was a musician who was commissioned to write a poem or a worship song. Sometimes there was a prophet who had a vision and they would dictate it to a scribe. Sometimes there was a leader in a community who wanted to contact another community, so they'd write a letter. A lot of the books that we have in the Bible, they're anonymous, so we don't know who all of the authors are, but we know a lot of them. Step 2 is editing. There's no publishing industry in the ancient world, so there weren't professional editors. But what would happen is if there was a document that was important, that people wanted to keep, they were often kept in royal courts or by priests in temples. They would collect them. And if they wanted to preserve them, they would often put them together in a collection or a library. And sometimes the people would add introductions to it or conclusions to it, explaining what this book is or what it's about. They'd add transition statements or little things to make explanatory comments to help you understand it. As you read the Bible, you may see some of those sorts of things. Step 3 was selecting the books. You got to remember that the books we have in the Bible are not the only books that were written in the ancient world, and they're not even the only books that were written by Jews or Christians. So why do we get these books in the Bible? There's a process that we called canonization. The word canon just means standard or measure. And so the official list of books in the Bible is called the canon of Scripture, and the process of selecting those books is called canonization. But who decided what would be on the list? Well, for the books in the Old Testament, those are the books written before the time of Jesus, they were agreed upon by the Jewish community. This was something that they discussed over time, and over time they realized these are the books that we know are from God, and these are the ones that aren't. And those were agreed upon well before the time of Jesus. The New Testament books, those are the ones that were written after the life of Jesus. Those were agreed upon by Christ followers over the course of the first few generations of the church. It was a process of Christians all over the world discussing and discerning which books do we think are reliable, which ones do we think are from God, and which ones aren't. And there was a general agreement about this, but every once in a while someone would come along and challenge it. They'd say, what about this book? Or do we really want to include that book? And they would discuss and they would solidify which books they considered in and out of the canon. I'll tell you what did not happen in this process, though. A small group of people did not get together and say, we're going to decide on behalf of everyone, these are the books we're going to consider sacred. What especially didn't happen is the emperor did not call a group of people together and say, these are the books I want in the Bible. There is kind of a misconception that's out there that the Emperor Constantine dictated the list or called a group of people together to say, I want a list that suits my purposes. That's just simply not true historically. How did they decide which books would get in as the community was discussing them? The basic principle where they decided which books were in and out is whether or not the book was connected to either a prophet or an apostle. Basically, someone who had the authority to speak on behalf of God. Was it someone that was trustworthy? Someone who God had actually commissioned to tell us things? Was it someone who actually had the credentials and the reliability to tell us something true? So because of that, they very seriously considered the date of the books that they were reading. So for example, the Gospels, which are the biographies of Jesus, they said, we are not going to consider a biography of Jesus, adding it to the Bible, unless the person who wrote it was living during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. If someone couldn't go and check and say, was this really true? Did you really see that? Then we're not going to consider that book at all. The books that we have were all written during a time frame when they could be fact-checked. Another criteria was, is this a book that was recognized widespread by a lot of Christians? Okay, so it wasn't okay for one little group over here to be like, oh, we just love this book. It means so much to us. And they really wanted to add it when everybody else read it and they say, this seems kind of a little bit weird. It had to be something that people with God's Spirit across different places and different cultures could say, yeah, we all recognize that God speaks through that book. Another criteria was, is the book consistent with something we already know? Okay, if there's already a book that we know is in the Bible, you don't want to add a book that's completely contradictory to that. So they would say, is this consistent with what we already know? And then there is, of course, the subjective piece. There is the experience of when we read this, does it seem like God is speaking? Does it seem like God is moving when this happens? Now, you can't, measure that or quantify that, but that's the sort of thing that over the course of time, when many, many people say, it sure seems like God speaks through this, that you start to say, maybe there's something more to this. So those are the criteria that they were discussing as they added books to the canon. Step 4 is copying. Now, in the ancient world, there was no printing press. There was no electronic publication. Every single copy of the Bible was hand copied. Most of the copies we have of biblical documents were either made by a monk or a scribe. We don't actually have the original copies of the books of the Bible. So the question is, how do we know we have the right version? Couldn't there have been mistakes? I mean, we've all played a game of telephone, right? You get 10 people in a circle and you whisper something into the first person's ear, and as they pass it along, mistakes get added, and at the end, it's purple monkey dishwasher, right? Something crazy, something silly, completely different from the thing that it started with. How do we know that didn't happen with the Bible? As it was copied again and again and again, more mistakes got added, right? Well, here's how we know they're accurate. The first thing is this: the people who made the copies were incredibly careful. Okay, the difference between them and the game of telephone is in the game of telephone, you kind of want things to get messed up, right? That's where the fun is. It's in the humor of things being different at the end. But these folks, they really wanted to get it exactly right. They considered this sacred, every single word. And so they had methods of double checking. They had multiple people who would oversee things. They had different methods of going back to the original copy to make sure they got it right. They were really, really careful in how they did this. Also, we have a lot of copies. Okay? This actually makes it easier to figure out what the original said. More than any other ancient book, we've got thousands and thousands of copies of the documents of the Bible. And so what we can do is we can actually compare the different copies and say, where was a mistake in this one that's different from the mistakes that were in this one, and realize what the accurate version would have been. It's sort of like if you played 100 games of telephone and you gave every single group of people the same starting sentence. At the end, they might have mistakes in that sentence, but they'd be different mistakes. And if you knew the outcome of all 100 games, you could reconstruct the original sentence really well. Let me give you a simple example, okay? Let's say that you had 4 documents and they each had these sentences on it, okay? The first one said this: I love you to the moon and black. The second says, I love you through the moon and back. The third says, I'll fly you to the moon and back. The fourth says, I love you to the moon. Now, the differences in those, that you can see where they happen, and none of them got the original right, but I bet you know exactly what sentence the original said. Here's another reason we know that we've got the right versions. The differences that we have, the places where we've got things where we say, it seems like someone copied it wrong, that we're not really sure what word is supposed to be there, they are so insignificant that it does not change the meaning of the sentences. There is nothing in any of the variations that we cannot figure out that actually changes the content of the Bible. We know what the message is, even if we know this word might be a little bit different in the original. Let's go on to the last step. Step 5 is translating. Now, the original documents of the Bible were written in the languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And those are languages that most of us don't know. Even the modern versions of Hebrew and Greek are not the same as the ancient versions that are in the Bible. So they need to be translated. Modern translations are done by a community of scholars. There's often a group of experts in the field, and they will work together on translating the documents of the Bible. And they'll check each other's work, and they'll debate tricky phrases and say, how should this be translated? So most modern translations are done by the best of the best in their field. The question, though, is why are there so many translations? If you've ever gone online to buy a Bible, you start to realize, oh man, there are a lot of options of different things. Why do we have lots of different versions of this? Is this one better or that one worse? How do we know? Well, part of the reason there are many different translations is there are lots of different ways to say certain words and ideas in each language. So if you're bilingual, you know this. If you've ever been asked to translate something, you know that sometimes you say, well, I could say it this way, or I could say it that way. Same is true with the biblical languages. There are also different philosophies of translations. Sometimes people say, what I really want is something that's very word for word. I want to get one word for this word, one word for that word, one word for that word. Or others will say, well, different languages you got to go phrase for phrase or idea for idea because it doesn't sound exactly right if you go word for word. So there's different philosophies of translations that have different strengths and weaknesses. More than that, languages change over time. If you translate something in 1 year and then you wait 50 years, there are some things that we said a certain way 50 years ago. We don't say them that way now. This is especially the case with the really old translations. So I've mentioned in a previous video, the King James Version, there's a lot of good things about that. It was an amazing translation of the Bible back in 1611 when it was first translated. And there are lots of things that are said in the King James Version that made a whole lot of sense in the 1600s, the era of Shakespeare and so on. But 400 years later, we're looking at that and we're saying, I don't know exactly what those phrases mean. I'm not sure what that is. And some of these words, I think they mean something different than what they used to mean. And so it's really important that we have modern translations that update those things so that we can understand what was being said in the original context in our context. So the question is, which translations are good? Well, the cheeky answer is this: the translation that you'll read, okay? If you have a translation that you say, I can't make heads or tails of this, and so you set it down and you don't even bother to engage with the Bible, well, that's not going to be useful for you. A translation that I'd recommend would be any modern translation that was made by a committee, a group of people, not one individual. The three best translations I think right now are the NIV, which stands for New International Version, the NLT, which stands for New Living Translation, and the ESV, which stands for English Standard Version. Now, there are some other good translations, but I know those three are really, really solid. Here at our church, we use the NIV translation, the New International Version. That's the one that we recommend. We make it so that it's consistent. You know, if you've got an NIV and you come to our church, you're going to hear it read that way. If you're in a group discussing the Bible, most people are going to have that version, so it's going to be easy to understand. And we think it's a good blend between really rigorous translation and very readable translation. And so we recommend the NIV around here. So that's how we got the Bible. It was a process of writing, editing, selecting, copying, and translating. Now, you may be wondering, okay, why do I need to know all of this? Okay, we want you to know because you might not know, and someone might not have told you and just assume you knew where it came from. But we also don't want you to be surprised. Sometimes people get into the Bible and they're like, oh, this is really great. And then someone says, but did you know there was a messy process behind this? And all of a sudden their faith gets rattled, or they start to wonder if they can depend on this book. And so we don't want you to be surprised and let you know, yeah, we do know where this book came from. But more than that, I want you to be thankful about this. There was a long process to get us this book. And this book is such a gift. And to think all of that work and all of that labor and all of the things that God orchestrated for us to have this, it's really, really incredible that we have this. And we should be thankful for it.